And museums based on a Euro-American model were built to build the museums that they built, and desired. People like Murray, Bernard Fagg were cogs in the system, faulty cogs that sometimes pushed back against the system and built these museums in spite of the system. Um, like, for example, you talk about in the building of the Jaws Museum how Fagg just completely circumvented the colonial machine, and just did it basically on his own. And how he lived in Murray's house and he bought in while he was on leave so that the artwork he collected wouldn't have just been thrown away by colonial administrators. So there was something different at work where, the British were recognizing the colonial heritage, which is another form of colonial control and disregard for culture. But it took what you call these museum-minded individuals to make these museums happen. And I think this is really important for our understanding of how colonialism works. People are not just automatons in this destructive machine, but individuals making choices within the system. And knowing these micro narratives of colonialism help us understand how it was constructed, with the ultimate aim, as you point out, of rectifying it and thinking beyond it. And as I was reading, I appreciated how the book let Murray exist as this very complicated, complex, problematic human being, without overly editorializing his long quotes. You let him speak for himself, and we really got this insight into his mindset and the colonial system that he was working within. So you let him exist as the messy human being that he is. And at the same time, when you talk about Murray's collecting agenda for an eventual museum, how he bought objects with his own money and how he stored them at his own house, you write, and I quote from page 56 here, that, quote, his interest in maintaining control could be read in two different ways: that he wanted the authority over the collection to shape where and how it is displayed, asserting colonial construction of ownership over the Nigerian visual culture. It could also be interpreted that Murray saw himself as a steward, holding the collection in his care for posterity. Most likely, both readings are true, end quote. And to me, this passage here encapsulates the nuances that you're trying to get at the book. With the book, we have to think of terms of both, instead of either or. And you don't let Murray off the hook, and you point out his blind spots, especially when it comes to his single-mindedness about the European viewpoint towards what constitutes a museum, what he believes about artwork preservation, sometimes against the direct wishes of people who he was collecting objects from. And he is committed to, quote, saving Nigeria's, quote, dying artistic heritage, but seems oblivious and maybe even willfully ignorant as to why this heritage is so-called dying and needs so-called saving to begin with. And he has the belief, along with many other people quoted in the book, that he's necessary because Nigerians themselves don't appreciate their own cultural heritage, which is, of course, a deeply patronizing and offensive position. So to be working from that position to begin with, is of course inherently problematic. But at the same time, there's a recognition that in order to understand, or in order to hold power within this museum system that Murray constructed, people did need to be trained in curatorial and conservation techniques, because this was not the education that people had grown up with. So he championed that and promoted that. And it was also interesting how he fought for repatriation of Nigerian art and did want Nigerians to be custodians of their own cultural heritage. But, and this is a big but, he seems to recognize this agency only in people who are willing to work within the colonial constructed museum system that he subscribes to. When owners want to retain agency over the possessions of their objects, he seems far less understanding. And it is striking how Murray, although he condemned the ways in which art objects left Nigeria, he was very fast to identify bad actors and stop them from taking artwork out. He himself glosses over his own coercive collecting practices. And throughout the book, there are hints at the way that Murray countered resistance from owners of the objects that he collected. And this comes to a head towards the end of the book in your description of how the Oran Museum was built and how the collection of Ekpu ancestor figures was amassed. And I was taken aback when I read about the woman who did not want to relinquish her Ekpu ancestor figure, and then she was persuading Murray and local leaders. And so I was really glad that you picked that up in the conclusion and you fully unpacked it. And you rightly pointed out that Murray saw owners of the art objects that he wanted to collect as basically hindrances, people that he had to work around, quote unquote, persuade, as he says, finagle, maybe kind of manipulate in order to get the objects that he wanted. So this leads me to a question. The calls for repatriation of Nigerian objects from international museums is well known, but has the National Museum of Nigeria or any of its regional satellites been subject to the same calls of returning objects collected by Murray back to the communities? As we know, there's a precedence for this in the United States with Native American objects being returned back to communities, and your book might be maybe a catalyst for this. I haven't heard anything about it in Nigeria, but I'm wondering if, now that international spotlight is held on repatriation efforts, if there might be rumblings of the domestic movement at the national level as well. And lastly, I just want to end with something I thought was very interesting that you mentioned several times in the book, Murray's commitment to a united Nigerian and Nigerian identity that transcended regional, ethnic, and religious identities. And that to help foster this in the museum, he did not put ethnic groups on wall text labels, but instead cities and towns where the objects were from. And I thought this was really fascinating and an interesting intervention into African art history, providing an alternate way that art historians can classify objects or present them to audiences or identify them, and also an intervention in how to think about Nigerian politics, national identity, and ideas of unity. And somewhat related to this, you talk about the effects the Nigerian Civil War had on the national collection and museums. It clearly had a devastating effect on the Ekpu ancestor figures and museums in what became Biafra. But you also mentioned that collections elsewhere in the country were affected. So on a purely selfish level, because my research is on art related to the Nigerian Civil War, I'm wondering what these effects were, and also if the national collections were used in any way to promote Nigerian national identity, ideas of unity and diversity during the war. You point to this in the last where you set up a possible second project to come after your own that you just did. What happens to these museums in their post-colonial context? So I know this is beyond the scope of the book, but it's really interesting, and I think it speaks to the importance and the power of the book, that it lays the groundwork to thinking about these questions, to think about Murray's legacy of de-emphasizing the ethnic identity of an object's creator at a time of a conflict that was often framed and written about in ethnic terms, while also considering that at this point, Nigeria's unity of its colonially designated borders were being directly challenged by the Civil War. So I think that's probably around 10 minutes. So I'll stop there. And again, thank you. It was a very insightful read, and I'm looking forward to discussing the book more with you and everybody else on this panel.
Thank you, Rebecca. Very good start off to the discussion. Before I go to the next person, your question at the end there, which will come up in our discussion later, I just want to point out that, yes, indeed, there's been contestations from indigenous owners of objects to the National Museum for return of objects. One particular one I remember clearly because it was front page news in a local newspaper about a community in the Anambra region asking the National Museum to return some objects to them. The reason I remember it is because of the title of the article that discussed this. It was titled "Give Us Back Our Gods," and so I remembered it for that peculiar title, like "Give Us Back Our Gods." You know, we had all these discussions at the University of Nigeria about gods in captivity and the implications of that, you know, for continued cultural progress and revitalization. All right. I'm going to go next to Francine Colaban-Colley of the University of Birmingham. Francine, can you take over, please?
Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina, so it's 6 a.m.
Yes.
here. It's 3 a.m. for you, Sylvester, and Rebecca, I think you're 6 a.m. too. My interest in Nigeria has been lifelong. I remember reading a book in college where Africa was portrayed as being primitive people dancing around naked in a fireplace. That's the Jansen book. And totally ignorant of their history. And having seen the National Museum in Lagos as a child growing up, I was horrified by the way art history has talked about Nigeria and its people. And so my interests are the contemporary arts in Nigeria. And I'm working on 3 women who have not been spoken about in as much detail as I think they should. And the only person whose name I'm going to get out at this point is Nike Okundaye. My dissertation works on her and 2 other artists in terms of where they fit in the art historical discourse in Nigeria, as well as the global platform. One of the beauties of this book, Amanda, is that you bring into sharper focus as to how were museums created and the nuances and the fact that you had over 2,000 letters and you were able to dig very deeply into those letters was a nuance that I don't think many people have had before as to what was the Colonial project when people like Leo Frobenius came in, and then you had the William Bascom's case. And all of these stories are quite important. One of the things that, as an art educator, I was interested in particularly was the correlation between art education and the museum system. And I was interested in what was that European model that this painter on a balloon wanted. And so I think I'm going to postpone some of those questions till we get to the discussion part, because I believe that's your next project, or I hope that's your next project. When you're looking at the ties between Nigerian educators, the education system, the pedagogy. The question is, did they live with Nigeria or they live around Nigeria? And I'll explain what I mean a little further. So one of the questions that, to me, that I really, really want us to discuss a little bit is this comment that you made on page 19, and it says, whereas Murray's pedagogy legacy perpetuated a colonial narrative, his instinct to develop a museum did not. And so I'm really curious to have a little further discussion about that. And one of the things that resonated throughout to me was, where was the voice of Echo Ayo? I wanted to hear his voice because he was the Nigerian that was dubbed, anointed, pick whatever adjective you wish, to take over the system afterwards. And I really passionately would have loved to have heard a little bit more of that relationship that he had, not with the Nigerian government, but what he thought of the collecting processes and things that went on. And yes, you are actually right, Amanda. You mentioned that there was a disregard for many of the cultural values and belief systems. And so, again, this goes back to my question is, where is the voice of the African? Whether it is the Oni of Ife or the deity worshiper or even the Nigerian curators. I just missed that voice. And that's really pretty much what I'm focusing on. And I can go on, but because I anticipate that we can have a rich conversation as to all of these questions that I mentioned, I will turn it back over to the moderator and the chair of our committee and let us go on so we can get into a fruitful conversation.
Thank you, Francine. That's a very good question that you raised at the end about the voice of the African. And yeah, it's an important question and we'll tackle it later. I think I can interject at this point that we did have Amanda spell out the scope of this project, at the beginning, and her centering it around Murray's letters kind of narrows that focus in a specific way.
Right.
And the work of Epoeyo, as far as I know, was mainly post-colonial. Like he took over the museum in a post-colonial context, and then he worked on that for quite a while. So while that's an important question on the immediacy of its relevance to the book project itself, it would have been nice to hear some more about the individual. But as everyone seems to be saying here, Amanda, perhaps that's more for your next project. This new book we're all sort of anxiously awaiting for you to write, which, might or might not come, but I think we want to focus on the one you've already written here. So I'm going to be steering our discussion in the direction of the book that we have before us. So Olubukola Gbadegesin, can you please take over?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I'll do my introduction and then I'll get into my remarks, which I'll keep brief because I'm also eager to get into the conversation. My name is Olubukola Gbadegesin. I am an associate professor in art history and African American Studies at St. Louis University. My own research focuses on photography, the history of photography, specifically in Nigeria, broadly West Africa.
Sorry, let me interject there. Your voice is coming through very shakily, and it's echoing somewhat. Do you have another? Okay, if you can get closer to the microphone and
I
a little
can.
louder, please.
So I was going to say afterwards that after I did my introduction that I'm actually in Spain right now. It's about 1 p.m. I'm in an airport. So you may start hearing some other voices. I'm gonna try to raise my voice. I found a nice quiet corner, so hopefully it'll stay quiet, but no promise. It's better, my voice now.
Yes, it is very much better.
Excellent. Excellent. So like I was saying, my research is on the history of photography in Nigeria, specifically West Africa more broadly. And my research actually currently is kind of manifested into this manuscript that is the very last stages, about to send it out to the editor. And it's looking at photography in Nigeria from 1850 to 1960. So I was actually, talking to a colleague about this book and about the panel that we're having now, saying that, my own work really looks at sort of the institutional uses of photography throughout Nigeria from this era, from 1850 to 1950, thinking about colonial uses, missionary uses, in terms of commercial spaces as postcards and also in the press. And so I was thinking about the comments that Amanda made and the wonderful observations you made about the use of photography that folks like Duckworth, who apparently also had ambitions to be a professional photographer, Fagg, of course, and Murray, the ways that they used photography to survey African art. And of course, there has been a recent kind of upspring of or wellspring of research and writing about sort of the ways in which that kind of work, that originally ethnographic and anthropological work, has very much shaped in sort of modern and contemporary notions of art as of African art as sort of an aesthetic form, an aesthetic way. And so my own interests kind of came indirectly into this book. I mean, obviously I have deep interests in Nigeria, being just my area of research, but I was really pleasantly surprised to see the mentions of photography and also the shout out to St. Louis with Forest Park. That was really, well, that was a nice surprise as well. So on that note, I do want to get into my remarks. I won't keep this going too long. I want to start by actually really thanking the officers and the volunteers and the sponsors that made the Lagos Studies Association and these forums possible year after year. To be able to have these discussions about our histories and its impacts really brings out the value of our work as scholars. And to that point, a big congratulations to Amanda for her work with this book. You've done a really admirable job of drawing a clear narrative out of really very complicated personal, professional, local, regional, state, international political landscape that really shaped Nigeria's system of museums that we know now. And I want to, again, like Francine, I want to keep my remarks brief and just focus on a few points that you touched on in your work. On another LSA panel a few years back, a point was raised about how important it is to collect and archive the papers of impactful scholars of African studies in various subfields. So I was really impressed by the amount of deep research that you've done to pull this together. I know you've covered this a little bit in your preface and in your introduction, but I'd really love it for you to expand more on the decisions, the writing decisions that you made about sort of balancing the need to tell the narrative with interjecting your own critical voice, right? And like Rebecca mentioned, Murray is a very contentious figure, and these discussions are incredibly thorny. I mean, just reading it, I could sort of sense the tension in your writing, and you kind of elaborate on it a little bit towards the conclusion and sort of make some of your own statements about sort of how you feel about what you read and about the research that you dug into. But I'd love for you to kind of elaborate on that a little bit more in terms of the writing decisions that led to the work that we're looking at now. In the narrative itself and the book itself, I was really struck by what seemed like a conflict of interest, to put it mildly. I'm just going to say what seemed like a conflict of interest with British colonial officials both buying artifacts for the British museums and collaborating to repatriate others, right? And just on the surface, you just see that there are so many issues within this, and I want to sort of hear from you a little bit how you, knowing what you know and knowing everything that you did not actually read in the book that you may have had to leave out for editorial reasons, how do you reconcile this apparent conflicted dynamic, right? There are other various conflicted dynamics at work in this story, like the very idea of what is a Nigerian museum. There are parts of the narrative, and I won't go into detail about this in my remarks, but there are parts of the narrative where you kind of shift between calling the museum Nigerian and calling it a colonial, like calling it Murray's project or Fagg's project. And so it's towards the end, when it gets closer to independence, that you start to call it a Nigerian museum. And I just want to kind of understand how you make that shift. Like, at what point for you does it become a Nigerian museum, right? So again, the very idea of what is a Nigerian museum, and, along with that, what others have already mentioned about the discrepancy between the British Western ideas of what a museum ought to do and be, and the Nigerian, or the more accurately framed, ethnic ideas of what it means to honor and venerate objects, right? So on the one hand, British and Western ideas of what a museum ought to be, and on the other hand, ethnic ideas of what it means to honor and venerate objects and artifacts. Now, as mindful as Murray was to identifying the objects, I just find it really fascinating that he was not as mindful to contextualizing the ways in which they were understood by the people that he was collecting them from. So yes, I want to kind of talk a little bit more about that in terms of like defining, what is a Nigerian museum. And sort of on the fourth level of my comments or remarks, I want to talk a little bit about the legacy of the museum building process, right? This project. There's so many questions still sort of at large. For one, Murray and Fagg both seem to be really committed to the idea of leaving museums to Africans, like Francine has already mentioned. But it's not until the 1960s with the late, great Dr. Ayo that this was actually achieved. And I'm curious about what became of the museum school at Josh, right? What was the curriculum in that school? That was like the first big effort to really institutionalize a museum education in Nigeria. What was the of that school? And you mentioned in your book that its goal was not necessarily to produce curators, right? So how did Murray or Fagg ever hope to produce a Nigerian director for the museums when the schools that they themselves were sort of launching did not have these objectives in hand, right, at their core, right? And then lastly, and again, kind of pulling through this thread of legacy, I'm curious about if there's any coda that you would offer to your conclusion that addresses the recent opening of the John Randall Center for Yoruba Culture and History in Lagos in October. And, you talked a little, basically everything that's in your book is still very much, not everything, maybe not the parts of Murray and his ideas of race, but I think the issues of like, what is a Nigerian museum? What is this museum? What is this museum for? I think those questions are still very much could be asked about a place like the John Randall Center. I'm curious about, what your observations are about that museum based on sort of where you landed with your deep dive into the historical origins and the makings of the Nigerian museum system that we know. I'm going to end there and excited to have this conversation.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to give Amanda, some time to respond to this and then to some of the questions and issues you raised.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Can you hear me okay? I think these are all really incredible questions and thoughts, and I'm just really grateful. I know it's not easy probably to have a panel like this and make remarks in front of parts. And I'm also incredibly grateful because I know everyone woke up very early to be here or are in transit. So I am really grateful. I would like to address basically every question here because I think that it really does get at the heart of what's happening. And I also appreciate the way in which you noticed the sort of internal struggle that I had with this material, with what's not there, with what was not in the archive, and also how it really does conflict with both how we think of museums today and what the goals are and what the industry is struggling with, but also thinking about kind of what is the value of a museum, and also thinking about the way in which Murray and this whole cohort was going into this project, these projects, thinking that there were no museums in Africa, right? That this was a service that they were providing. And I think where I really struggled was that I'm somewhat agnostic when it comes to what a museum is, that I think that they can look incredibly differently. They can function very differently while serving their mission to both protect the integrity of the object and make those objects accessible to the public. And I think that that's sort of what's interesting here, is that they actually missed all of the museum models that already existed in Nigeria when they were creating, really they weren't museologists, right? They weren't thinking critically about the museum space, not a single one of them, not even William Fagg, right? They were like modeling it off of other British institutions, right? So they were sort of doing imaginary, playtime with museums. What do you need to make a museum? You need a big room with lots of lights, cases, and labels, right? And that makes a museum. And so I think that's how it really did start. But I think it kind of evolved over that time. Would you like me, Professor Ogbechi, to start addressing some of the questions, or do you think a few additional thoughts would be useful at this time?
No, you can begin to address the questions.
Okay. So I'm just going to start at the top, and I think that if I missed some, we can go back, because there were a lot of really good points. Thinking about one, how I dealt with Murray, what I came to sort of realize was how human he was, and absolutely some deplorable actions and positions, and also some really interesting positions. But the way in which he was sort of doggedly trying to create the museum meant that he was singly focused, right? Like he went in supporting Ben and Nwonwu in teaching him, right? And then sort of was not interested in supporting modern and contemporary art as his career continued, because he was just so focused, I think, on the museum. And I think that also played into his practice, right? He wanted to have his cake and eat it too, right? He wanted the object, and he kind of, he wanted to try to be respectful, but do both. And I think that to the collector. So I think that really created this tension that really is the most colonial way of acting, right? Because he really wasn't able to sort of adjust his behavior and actually be a good steward to the object, or to, the people he was working with. But I think, some of the interesting questions, like, has the National Museum System been called to repatriate objects? The answer is yes, but the same issue that we have in the larger scheme of repatriation and the request for repatriation exists on that scale, which is that people don't know what exists in the collection, that there's such limited access to the entire collection that, I think communities don't know to even ask for a lot of objects back, right, when it would be appropriate. The other aspect is not everybody outside of Nigeria, not all museums are really thinking about repatriation as this sort of service that sends work back to where it should be, right? Most museums, especially national museums, are required to send it back to a federal government. And that's really where this sort of issue around where the Benin bronzes should go, I think, has become even more complicated, right? So an example is the Chrysler Museum that just sent an Akwanshi back. Now it's been 2 years. Has it been that long? The Akwanshi back. We don't know where it is now. They didn't even send it back to the National Commission for Museums and Monuments. They sent it with the government. We know exactly where it came from, right? They knew that. There's an in situ photograph, but they didn't send it back to the community, and they sort of said it's not our responsibility to do that. It's Nigeria's responsibility to do that. So I think some of it is not just would communities request objects back. There's no sense of what's there. So I think that that sort of exists in a very real way and is a really big problem. I also, you know, I think that Murray's sort of ambivalence around ethnic groups and, you know, where the object belongs and came from as separate from the city of origin, right, is sort of an interesting one that I think you know, kind of identifies that there is movement in the art market, that there, you know, that the creation of art across the continent is not necessarily specific to one group. And so it is sort of interesting, but I think it was really just a cataloging method for him too. That is both kind of important and misses the point, right? As all of these things, it's like good and bad. And then, you know, thinking about how the museum was used, I think after the Civil War was probably when you started to really see the museum used as a way to create a Nigerian identity, which I think in part was really due to Ekpo, right? And his contribution, and probably more than the governments, though I think they were opportunistic in how they used the collections. And I think we can keep going on and on, but I think moving on Francine's contributions, which I really appreciated, because I actually set out on this project looking for the Nigerian voices. That it was, I had sort of done the work of reading the letters of Murray and thinking about his contribution. And it seems like the piece that was really lacking from my research. And so I would say one of the big critiques of this book, and the one that's sort of been missed actually a lot of people, is there are lots of holes, right? That and some of it is Ekpo, which his son was Etam was incredibly generous, did lots of interviews with him, and he helped me connect with his mother and shared photographs and was just incredibly generous. But there was sort of a limitation to what that could actually provide about Dr. Ayo's experience, like creating this museum, taking over, you know, guiding it through a civil war and all of these new regimes and this sort of reinvigoration of the arts as well. So that to me is the second volume. And I state that very clearly. I would say that like the coda for me was actually that final chapter that turned into a chapter, right? Because I felt like I had to tie up Murray's story. But you know, I do think that from independence on, the museum system becomes something different. And you have all these new players with Peace Corps and the volunteer overseas service. And so it really is a very different project from that moment on. And yes, I mean, I also think that Bernard Fagg's voice is missing. And his daughter wasn't quite as forthcoming with help in archival material. So it was frustrating to me in part because I felt like this isn't the opportunity. There's probably not going to be somebody else who's writing another book about, you know, the foundation of museums. Like, I don't know, you know, but so this is a really important opportunity to make sure that his voice was heard, and he had a very strong voice, and I couldn't include it. And the other piece was Liman Chiroma's voice, and he wrote an autobiography, and I think it was due to COVID that I really was not able to get my hands on it. And so I think, you know, he was being tapped to be the director, and I think they would have turned over the directorship much earlier, like maybe even before Bernard Fagg left the country, if he had stayed on with the museum service. And and I couldn't get my hands on his autobiography. So it's floating around. That's a space that I think is really important. The other piece is that it was really hard to track people down because they're often not even mentioned in the annual reports or in the ledger of, working for the Colonial Service. So it's a huge lack. And I think it is also my biggest critique of the entire project. And I think, Duckworth also provides a really good Democratic his whole story, but he's also sort of a bizarre character in that he's an opportunist who wants to just get ahead in the Colonial Service. He's sort of taking advantage of some of that excitement about a museum project. The other piece that I'll add there is I definitely wrote this from the perspective of a museum administrator at this point. I mean, it really did change how I approached this material in a different way and how I sympathized with all of the players in the decisions that they have to make, but also the way in which it is so easy for, the upper administration, whatever that may be, government or a university parent organization, right, to get excited about the museum. It's much harder to invest in it because it's nothing but, sunk costs. Essentially, it costs a lot of money and it's not a huge revenue generator, right? So this sort of idea that the museum is exciting, but also is not really a priority, that is the case that I saw there. That's the case now. So it's a really kind of interesting dynamic to sort of start from. Talking about Buki's thoughts, which I think are really, really great. I mean, I definitely made a lot of decisions. And I think from the final manuscript cut over 25,000 words from the whole project. And I think that my opinions were not shared by Murray most of the time. So it was important for me to very much present what was happening. And I don't think it was, I don't think there were lots of things that I could add to the conversation about, colonialism writ large or how colonialism, shaped Nigeria. But thinking about, sort of on the ground work that was happening and the internal and external conflicts that were happening constantly, I think is a really important piece. And I think your question about the shift between the Colonial project and the Nigerian museum and when the shift happens, that is such a poignant, observation. And I think, again, it comes to the fact that I don't necessarily feel like a museum should look a specific way. It needs to meet the needs of the community. And hearing the accounts and reading account after account of how many people came to the museums for their openings, and then in the sort of years after, kind of up until the Civil War, was incredibly moving. And like anything, that's all you want as somebody who creates a museum, right, is for people to come. And it was really used by Nigerians, and they were traveling from all across the country to come, see these spaces and see these works of art. And so that I think, I don't know if it was this sort of intentional, like this is the moment. But I do think that, the Bernard Fagg and Kenneth Murray were creating these museums for Nigerians, not for colonial officers, the way you see in other spaces, right? Like Frank McEwen's projects and things like that. I really do think that whatever their intentions and whatever they were struggling with, they really did want Nigerians to come. And so I think that seeing the reverse for me was a big shift in how I understood, what this project was. I think definitely things like whether or not they were actually able to train curators and a new generation of people who were thinking about museums. Again, I think they were museum minded, but I don't think they were people who were thinking critically about these institutions, right? And that's a really important piece when you're thinking about how you sort of train the next generation of museologists, right? And people who are engaging with these spaces. Because if it's just learning how to keep them up and what's, standard practice is for caring for objects, and you miss the sort of critical piece of how these spaces build community, how they shape community, and the power that has, I think that you're going to sort of miss a lot of that. And the Joss Museum School was running, I think until about around 2010. I mean, I think Boko Haram actually was one of the instigators for dissolving the school. I think I didn't want to write this book in a lot of ways. Sydney Castor was pressuring me for a long time, but it really wasn't until 2019, 2020 that I said, okay, I think that there's something valuable here because of the way in which the calls for repatriation were amplified in a new way. Certainly not new. We know they're not new. And certainly this is a group of people who knows that it was highly entrenched. But I think the amplification of it, and more mainstream interest in it changed the way in which we were thinking about these institutions. And there were also sorts of museums that were, opening and, being built in Nigeria at this time. And I think that in some ways they were dehistoricized. The conversation was dehistoricized. And I felt like that was the value added, right? That thinking about how these were conversations that have been happening in Nigeria, in Lagos, in Jos for decades and decades and decades. And so here's this opportunity to sort of think about them in new ways, but we have to know that history. So I think that was actually one of the things that made me decide, okay, maybe maybe it's not just, like a project. I'm just publishing my research. I think it really would be something that could add to the conversation. So I'll leave it there.
It's before I open it to the audience, let me take the chair's prerogative here. It's an absolutely essential book. Yes. It's an absolutely essential book, and we have Professor Abidemi Babatunde, in the discussion space. I'm going to give you a chance to speak in a minute, but let me just quickly make this point I wanted to make. So I make the point that the book is essential. We've had it, with this book right now, I think we get a much greater understanding of the role and impact of Murray on the development of a huge context of historical practices in Nigeria. Most of the time, the discussion about his work with museums has been mentioned in passing in many ways. I know I did that in my own work, while we focus mainly on his role in the production of modern Nigerian art and co. But you do reflect in many parts of the book. I mean, you pointed out here that Murray was not, his focus was not on creating museum curators or whatever. He worked within the system as a very specific kind of project manager. And it occurred to me that was very interesting in relation to his work with modern Nigerian art as well. He did not set out to produce modern Nigerian artists. His primary process was training art teachers, which I continue to insist is greatly overlooked in our evaluation of the work he did. He set up a program to train art teachers. And similarly, in this museum, he set up a program to train museum managers, so that these individuals would emerge like in the person of someone like Ekweyo to become true museum professionals who reflected, on the meaning of the museum and the idea of the museum within their own cultural practice. That's a very interesting thing to have come out. But in both instances in which he intervened in these processes, he was doing something very specific that had wider implications in general. So, Professor Babatunde, can we have you contribute to the discussion, please, if you have any comments?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Yeah, congratulations, Amanda. I think most of my points, she has actually addressed most of them. But there's one I would like to mention. I think I'm an archaeologist, and I study at the University of Ibadan, where you cannot really, run away from getting to know Kenneth Morris' work and how, his involvement in the development of museum in the colonial Nigeria. But one thing I found really interesting in the Morris work for me is that my work is on Ile-Ife. I work on the glass, glass technology and production in the classical Ife. And while I was developing my project as a graduate student, of course, I cannot run away from looking at Morris' work. And I found a compilation of historical and the archaeological sites in Ife that he did in 1948. And I found that really interesting. And that really kind of got me thinking about how archaeology was also, central to what he actually wanted to do. Of course, he was an art educator. He was going about collecting objects from particular period. But to me, I think it's not a coincidence that Isie was the first museum, in 1945, considering the soapstone, the collection of soapstone that were, uncovered there, and followed by Jos in 52, considering the knock and other, archaeological findings from Jos, and followed by Ife, in 1954, considering again the cluster of copper alloy objects that were uncovered in 1938, I think, and all other objects. But my question would be, how do you center Morris' interest in archaeology as well, in archaeological material? Of course, he was not really doing much of archaeology himself until when Bernard Fagg and also Epueyo, came into play. But of course, I didn't have time to read the book, like all the pages of the book. Of course, I read quite a lot of it as well. But I don't know if you can speak a little bit to that, how archaeology was also central to what he was doing in terms of, there was a lot of accidental discovery of archaeological sites at that time, connected to the construction of a lot of colonial projects at the time, which led to discovery of a lot of these archaeological sites, and how he manages that and how he plays that within the scheme of development of museums in Nigeria. And for me, it is not surprising that Lagos Museum was established in 57 after these other places where we have significant archaeological finds were the first location where the museums were established. And the Lagos, which was the center of the colonial administration at the time, now, museum was actually established much later in Lagos. So I don't know if you can speak to that. I think I will just limit it to that. But I will congratulate you for the very wonderful book. I think it's very, on many grants, it's a very, very successful project, which I find it really interesting. Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Shea.
Thank you, Prof. Yes, Amanda, please.
Thank you so much. And I had a feeling I would get a question like this when I saw you were on the panel, because I think it's a really important point. I'm not sure that I think Murray was all that interested in archaeology. And I think in part because you see in the letters that it's like almost a footnote to what he's trying to do and trying to say. I think he very much appreciated that it was going to, one, help him get museums. And two, I think he was very concerned about archaeologists or, people who were digging and the way in which that was going to affect his ability to, like, if we could just say, protect the objects, right? Keep them from being exported, make sure that they're properly cataloged, things like that. So I think he very much understood what archaeologists needed to do and how the museum and the antiquities department needed to sort of control that. But I don't like, you hear him, you know, he's going to support a dig, or, you know, the mentions even in the annual reports are kind of brief. So I actually think that that is another angle to actually really look at it from the perspective of the archaeologists and how they felt like they were supporting the museum service would be another sort of interesting sort of companion to this kind of work. So yeah, I mean, I do think he was sort of just not really that interested, but understood the importance of maintaining control over the archaeological work. Because, I mean, you know, when you look at FAG, I mean, he was kind of doing it just as a hobby before he was really able to fold it into the museum service, right, into the antiquity service. And it was just really important, I think, that he was trained and he was mindful of what he was doing, right? But I think Murray just sort of needed to control it more than, and needed to make sure that it was going through him and the department more than he was truly interested in it. And so I would have been curious, like if Bernard Fagg had taken over the antiquities department, say a decade earlier, we probably would have actually seen some different outcomes. But you can, I mean, like, there's just such a strong archaeological presence in Nigeria, you know, from that time. So I think it's that, you know, really started in that time. So I think it is sort of crucial that he, you know, thought about the archaeologists, but I don't know that he was super interested in archaeology.
Amanda, I think you actually gave a very good response to this question in the preface of your book. You said, you know, the book acknowledges, you know, the tremendous amount of work it took to do what Murray did, along with other directors like Fagg and Ayo, you know, what they accomplished. And quote, I wonder if Murray could have added more to his plate. I think that's really where the answer to that lies. Again, we're looking at all this, and you know, and this is a great question about his views on archaeology. He was federal director of antiquities after all, so he obviously had some interest in that. But we really must recognize the gargantuan amount of work that Murray did, from the very first surveys he did to his setting up the, you know, the school for the, you know, Umayyad group, to his work, you know, all consuming, as you point out in this, as this book demonstrates quite clearly, his all consuming effort to set up a museum system in Nigeria, which, you know, he championed with a very, very extraordinary amount of zeal and dedication, literally giving his life to this project, you know, having died on his way to a function regarding a museum in Benin City and all that. So we must acknowledge that and recognize, of course, you know, like the limitations that are imposed on the individual practicing within a colonial system that constrain them are similar to the limitations imposed upon an author who has to dig through, you know, an archive and then make the archive make sense to a reader in relation to the construction of the important narrative development of museums in Nigeria. And I think it's on that level that, you know, the book does justice to an interlocutor who himself, you know, was an extraordinary individual in the unfolding narrative of what Nigeria could be. So I'd like to invite, if anybody, we have some other people on the panel. If anyone has a question to address to the author, I'd like to invite them to present it. If we have that, I'd like to have the, yes.
Is there any question or comments? No questions, sir.
No questions. Okay. So I'd like to have the sorry, yes, you can.
I was going to ask that, of course, you stated it pretty clearly that you work mainly with Murray's letters that he wrote to his family, his mother, his father, and his sister, Betty. But I was wondering, and also you mentioned clearly the challenges in getting some of the archival materials here in Nigeria. The flood in Jos that destroyed some of them, and also those that are missing in Lagos that have been cited and are missing. I just wanted to ask if you were able to get any other form of correspondence, from Murray beyond the letter. Maybe were you able to get anything between him and his other colleagues, in the antiquity department or in the colonial office beyond, the letter that he, wrote, and he wanted it to focus on certain things, anything that really shows around his work, ethics, and of course, his relationship with the colonial officers and dealings with other people beyond the letters?
That's a really good question. And I will also note that I think my sense at some point that Murray asked his family to save these letters, because I think that Murray wanted to write a memoir about his experience, and that, just the great detail of the letters was pretty extraordinary. And there were a couple of documents, a copy of which was at the Lagos Museum, that kind of looked like the start of a memoir. It was just a very clear chronological layout of what was happening. And then I did have letters between Murray and Fagg, Murray and Bascom, and both brother Faggs, William and Bernard. And then a few letters between Murray and Duckworth. There was also some documents related to like external donors, and when he was trying to place his collection during World War II. In 1941, he sent the collection that he had amassed to South Africa. He tried to get it placed in Chicago because he was worried about the reach of the Germans. But I was often getting one half of the correspondence, or I was getting a reference to another letter in a letter to somebody else. So it wasn't that those things didn't exist, but they were not complete, and they were so sparse. So you might see one letter and then you realize there was a second correspondence, but then you don't have, but then you have the third. So there were just pieces. So there's a lot of material, but it became hard to sort of weave through the through line. The other piece that I struggled with is making sure that I wasn't just using, I was trying to piece out, or think out whether something that he mentioned in his letter was, really a personal correspondence to his mom. I think about how I present a story maybe a little differently to my mother than I do to my boss. That I know she's on my side. I want her to be angry with me, or I want her to be excited with me. And it's not necessarily telling the whole story. So I thought very carefully about, am I able to, corroborate this information with another document? And if I'm not, how do I make sure that I present it to show that it was really how he was feeling at that moment, not a reflection of what was really happening, or the complexity of what was happening, existed beyond how he was feeling. So I was incredibly mindful of that. which again added to the fact that there is so much more. And I wanted to show him as a person, but I also wanted to make sure that I was giving a complete story. And so that's also why I actually left out a fair amount of interview material that I had with, different folks, particularly it was, and this actually was a part of my decision making when I used this material for my dissertation. People started working, Americans and British students started working in Nigeria in the 60s and 70s. And, we started to see other characters sort of get involved. And what was sort of interesting is that, and I think about how even I have a lot of interns that work for the museum, their perception of the museum and what we're doing and how it's being built and sort of the tensions that are at play looks very different to them than it does to us. And so the information that I was getting, I think was really valuable information in that it told us an important story about how the museum was presenting itself externally, but it didn't really reflect what was happening internally. And so that tension, I think, is really important. I think it's a tension that will be criticized for, or that's what people are thinking. But it was a kind of clear effort to say, I really want to look at the internal aspects of this, because especially in the 60s, where I do feel like that should be treated kind of differently. But yeah, so it made it hard. So that's where I struggled with that, but also it doesn't quite exist in the full account that it does in the letters to his family. Did that answer your question?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. We have about 8 minutes left, so I'll give the panelists, a chance to round out our discussion here, starting with Rebecca.
Well, thank you so much for addressing everybody's comments and questions and hearing you talk about it. Especially, the work of shaping a vast amount of archival material into a digestible narrative. Especially, what you just added about the fact that these are letters to his family. And that, sets a totally different tone, which is something that I didn't, I was thinking about your use of letters, as I was reading and as you were presenting the material, but the fact that people's voices change depending, of course, on who they're talking to. It's just a natural human thing, and reconciling with that. That if you had the chance to interview Murray yourself, probably the narrative that he would tell you would be vastly different from the narrative that you uncovered in the letters, as you point out, with your narratives with people who were on the ground in the 1960s. I appreciate the immense amount of research. I'm very glad that you did finally decide to write the book, because as Professor Ogechi said, it really does make a really important contribution to the way that we understand museums in Nigeria today, and really the underpinnings of the system that now is being added to, and with all the museums that just opened, like the Randall Center that Buki mentioned, and the museum in Benin that's being built. It's hard to, it really provides this very important historical foundation for these current projects. So thank you.
Francine, please.
Yes, I still think that this book is doing a valuable service. One of the things that I kind of wondered was, what relationships did Murray have with Nigerians? We have a lot of information that he wrote back and forth. He worked with Duckworth, he worked with Fag, but I was wondering just how much of an interaction did he really get to know Nigerians for Nigeria, or was he the eternal colonial officer who came and lived in Nigeria for 30, 40 years And when he left, he was still the colonial officer. So that's one of the aspects of the book that I would been a little bit more curious about knowing as to how did he really about being in Nigeria and working, and did he have good relationships with Nigerians themselves? And then I still come back to this question, whereas Murray's pedagogical legacy perpetuated a colonial narrative, his instincts to develop a museum did not. So could you maybe comment on that a little bit?
Sure. He absolutely did have Nigerian friends. He was when he retired in 57, he was often found on a boat with the Fanti fishermen who were kind of sailing back and forth. So he was a part of that community. He built a home there, and I do think it's not necessarily documented in correspondence, but I do think he was very much a part of the community. He had never had any intention of going back to Britain, even though he established a foundation with his sister to preserve the land around his family home in Britain, but had no intention of ever going back. And I think that it is an important question to really think about, the sort of the way in which the museum, it is going to like struggle because again, it's not quite critical of itself as it's being built. And so I think that his ability to then again produce, his pedagogy is somewhat simple, right? In the sense that it's really thinking about basic skills and not being critical of the institution, which I would say today, all museum people, you don't go into museum work unless you love museums, because you do not get paid enough. You are constantly, it's kind of a toxic workplace because there's a lot of tension, right? Some people are supposed to preserve the integrity of the object, and some people are supposed to make it, accessible to the public. And those two things don't go together. And so those people are often in conflict. And so you go to it, you go to it knowing that this is a place for critique. And I don't think he was approaching it or training people to approach it in that way.
Yeah, Buki, please, just a slight comment before you begin. Francine, I think it's important. Sorry, Buki, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I
think it's important to realize that there were two Europeans who came to Nigeria in the colonial process and became Nigerians. One was Murray, the other was Susan Wenger. And, about Murray's relationship to the community, he actually did speak Yoruba. And, I think that's very important in understanding what kind of relationships. So, Buki, please.
Yes. Yes, again, congratulations on the book, Amanda. I'll keep it really short. I still want to have that conversation about John Randall Center, but maybe it's better offline. If you have any comments that you want to share about this subject, particularly, or any of the other institutions that have emerged, either specifically in Nigeria or models elsewhere, yeah, I'd love to hear it.
I think that might have to wait for another panel. We are in the very last minute of this panel, so I want to thank the author and the panelists, for your very important contributions to this discussion. I would like to, round it out by thanking the organizers of this conference and congratulate you on your ability to have kept this going and expanding and improving year after year. So we'll finish by giving Amanda a very big hand for her work. Hear ye, we hereby declare this book is extremely important and very relevant to our unfolding discourse. And that's my gavel right there. We're done. All right, guys. Thank you very much and bye.
Congrats,
Thank
Amanda.
you. Appreciate it. Thank you all.